Hey StFX, we're back with another interview today for our candidate interview series. So today we have Muir coming in from the PPC. So he's running in Central Nova and is the People's Party of Canada candidate this time around. So just before we start, just want to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I will pass it over to you, Al. So firstly, just would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and also what got you wanting to go into the world of politics?
Thank you for having me, Ben. I started getting involved seriously in politics probably 20, 30 years ago, and it was being a hunter, it was around the firearms issue and the Liberals' Firearms Act. I worked on that for many years, many trips to Ottawa, meeting with MPs, and found that we couldn't get what we wanted in the legislation. So as I worked on that, I thought, there were other issues I was concerned about, debt levels and stuff like that. So it got to the point where I thought I could have a more immediate effect if I went into politics directly rather than lobbying politicians on a continual basis and not really getting where I wanted to go.
Okay, fair enough. If you don't mind passing that back. No, it's great to know a little bit more about you, and also like that your entrance into politics was like a bit more issue specific, wanting to kind of be that voice for the issues that you saw pressing in the community. So that's fantastic to hear. My next real question for you is that obviously there are a number of key issues facing Nova Scotians and also like facing youth around the province, around the country, facing Canadians as a whole. So we're really just wondering, what do you see as the largest issues and what are the things that you want to tackle?
They're actually interrelated. I would say here in rural Nova Scotia, healthcare is certainly top of the bill. And I would say that affordability is the next issue that I'm hearing so much about. Both of them are interrelated, and those areas I covered in the last election, and I said, listen, we keep on coming back to these federal elections, and even though healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, we keep on coming back to it as a top issue election cycle after election cycle. And people would think that some of these issues would be resolved over time, and I said in the first debate of the last election that when the next election came around, if I was there, I'd be coming back and talking about the same thing. And here I am again, and healthcare has actually gotten worse. From a personal experience, I went to the outpatient clinic in Glasgow last week, and I got in at, my son told me if I went at a later time, I might be able to jig the system and get in a little quicker. And so I went at 10:30 at night, and I end up getting out at 6:45 in the morning. And you hear these issues about long delays and things like that, but what you don't see unless you get into the system is an even worse part of it. When I sat there, it came around to about 3 in the morning, and there was a lady next to me, and she had come in at 4 o'clock, and I was in at 10:30, and I was thinking, why this large gap between herself and myself? And then the nurse came out and had a stack of papers, patient papers, started going through them, doing a roll call of who was there. And the pile of who wasn't there kept on getting larger, and the pile of who was there still waiting to get help was getting smaller. So not only do we have a problem with wait times, we have a problem with people just not being able to access the system at all. And that problem is worse than the actual wait list. So and when you look at the issue of affordability, we have specific ways that we want to correct healthcare. They're not the same as the Liberals. They're not the same as the Conservatives. Okay. We talked about the monetary aspects of it in the last election. Prior to that, over a 10-year period, the government had doubled what was going into healthcare. And my argument then was it's not the money that's the issue. What happens here, particularly in Nova Scotia, is because there's so many transfer payments, the government has begun to create a bureaucratic class. There's probably, I think it's around 33% of the population works in the public sector. And that particularly applies to healthcare, where the management end is so top-heavy and so bureaucratic, it's hard for doctors to get timely answers on what they got to do. It's hard to make adjustments in the system. It kind of has that government slowness. Like, it's almost like your feel when you're down south and you're on vacation, that casual approach to government. And it's because there's so many layers that it has to go through to filter down to what actually needs to be done. Now, my argument then and consistently was that we have to be, the Canada Health Act is archaic. It's been around for a long time. When it was first brought in, we were one of the first countries that brought in publicly funded health care, which was a good thing. Everybody could get access to it, but because of that pride of being one of the first ones in, we are resistant to changing it. And as the world has changed and healthcare delivery has gotten more complex, we haven't changed along with it. Now, the other OECD countries have, like, I'll use Taiwan for an example. And what they have in Canada, if you talk to a politician, what they'll do is they'll try to define the issue as two-tier healthcare, where the rich get in quicker and where the rich get better treatment and the poor are down here. But in Taiwan, similar to the other OECD countries, it's a two-pathway system. You can go to a private clinic or you can go to a public clinic. They're all publicly funded. But what happens in the end is that the private clinics function so well because of the economics of business. Business knows how to be efficient, right? And they come up with these efficiencies, and then the public system sees their successes and it duplicates them. So the whole system improves across the board, and it's not a matter of you being able to get in and I not being able to get in. It's not that case, right? And so our resistance to looking at these new models to update the Canada Health Act to reflect that is holding us back on healthcare. So no matter how much money we throw at it, it'll tend to gravitate towards a bureaucracy and all this paper churning and stuff like that, and straitjacketing doctors and the real frontline people that we need to unleash to get this resolved, right? So in the case of the housing issue, housing, for example, and affordability, if you look at there's some things that are symptomatic of it. One thing is the money laundering, for example, and speculation. But those are merely symptoms of it. They go where the money is at. And that's the plain and simple thing of it. They're looking for a profit, and that's where they go. So, but we need to look at the fundamental causes of it. And we argued in the last election, and we were unfortunately called racist because we talked about immigration. And we believe that no subject is taboo, and this is an important public policy thing that we have to be concerned about. We have to set rational levels for immigration. The Liberal targets were 350,000. Our targets were 150,000. Now, when we were called racist, I said, if the Liberals' target isn't 500,000, aren't they racist? Because they're saying they want less than that. Yes, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what we think that the country can handle over any given period of time. So we warned that we warned then, and it was in our policy, it was on our pages way back that election, that if we continued with this immigration policy, that there would be problems in housing. So we're bringing in 350,000 people a year, which is the equivalent of the population in Nova Scotia, a little more than the population in Nova Scotia, over a 3-year period. And if you've been traveled around the province any amount, you would see the housing and infrastructure and everything, that kind of thing that you would try to build in 3 years. It's an almost impossible task. So we have that problem of the supply shortage, which drives up the prices. And then you look at it from the the government policy perspective. Now, the policy over the last 6 years has been spend, 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 spend. And the Bank of Canada knows that debt levels, consumer debt levels are high, private debt levels, and they look at the government debt levels and they say, well, we could get in real trouble here if the interest rates rise any significant amount. And what will happen is that the central government will try to keep the interest rates suppressed to cover that. And that suppression of the interest rates makes people think that they can get bidding wars, that this is never going to end. This low interest rate is never going to end, and they can continue to bid up houses and stuff like that. But what happens if in 2008, what they called the Great Recession, and that was strictly a housing bubble that burst. And this one is a little different, but it's that if we get that interest rate shock down the road, and it's even if it's of what you wouldn't think is significant, a 1 or 2, 3% percentage change, a lot of those people that overextended themselves in housing already are going to fall even further behind, and you'll find properties and a collapse of the housing market again, and we'll be in that cycle trying to bail people out again, and the government pouring more money in it. So the government's and not only is these $20 billion a year deficits, they're also fueling inflation. And that's like the inflation rate was 3.7% in July. And when you keep these continual inflation raises, that's directly related to your affordability, not only just your housing, but food, clothing, everything that you consume. And so what we're saying is, the Conservatives, if you listen to the radio ads that are out right now, what they're talking about is how the Liberal spending is irresponsible. Well, theirs is irresponsible too. They're promising $53 billion more in new spending, and that is and balancing the budget. Last election they were going to balance it in 5. This election they're going to balance it in 10. So if they keep on spending these amounts of money, they are also contributing to inflation. So it's kind of like accusing the Liberals of doing what you're already doing, right? So it's a false narrative on their part that.
Yeah, overall, there's a fair amount of issues at play.
Yes, they are, and a lot of them are interrelated.
Do you mind passing that back to me for a sec?
Yes, go ahead.
That mic there.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Yeah. So like overall, we got housing affordability, healthcare, limited supply, also inflation. All big issues that are kind of like key in your mind over the course of this election. I'll just bring it down to some of the more student-specific questions that we've got today. And the first really is just about like affordability and affordability of education. And it continues to be a barrier for a lot of kids that are looking to go to either college, any post-secondary institution out there. And Nova Scotia actually has the highest tuition average in Canada right now, which is quite crazy. So we're kind of just wondering, like, how would your party seek to address like these barriers and ensure that students that are looking to access a college degree, a certificate, diploma, degree would actually have the ability to do so?
When I went to university, I was in the science department, and I thought about switching over to dentistry. And when I filled in the application, there were questions about how much money your family made and stuff like that. So there was these barriers money-wise, and the perception was that if you didn't have enough money to back you up, then you couldn't, it might not be a good idea for you to apply to go in that profession. So there are a segment of the population that really needs help to get to access the system. But there are other segments of the society that can afford to pay their way through themselves. Now, the problem we run up against then is that with so many other pressing issues, with the aging population and the requirement for more health care, with the just general care in general for the elderly and old folks' homes and stuff like that, there's a tremendous amount of pressure. And the housing crisis and so on, and feeding more money into it, it further complicates the situation. So it's a delicate make a delicate removal. And I don't know if I'm answering your question here, but I've said it before in other interviews that we have finite resources. You wouldn't know it by the way the other parties are throwing money around and making promises now, but we do have finite resources. You would not run your finances the way the government is running them now. Any of the parties want to run them with their promises and everything. You know personally that you would be, the debt would overwhelm you. So I believe that we have to prioritize things, and I'm not going to be popular here, but I have to say that the student issue on the end of it is not as much a priority for us as some of these other more pressing issues. They say that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. Right. So our primary concern is people's health. So we have to look at these financial resources that are in short supply and look how they're allocated. And I see that from my own personal experience that there are people who need help with this. Now, favorable loans are one of the things, longer terms to pay it off. There's all kinds of options you can work on here. The issue of free education at this point in time is not a floater for us for the reasons that I've said. It's just that there are so many other pressing issues that we have to be concerned about. But again, we can certainly look at how we could alleviate some of these issues on how quickly it has to be paid back. And from, I know when we had, they were called vocational schools in my day, and now they're called community colleges. And oftentimes, I know in the German system, what they'll do is do more aptitude testing and so on to try to direct people into fields where they might be better suited to be, and where they can get more, there's more chance of them getting a job. And I think what the universities have to do is start appraising people of what, if you take these specific sets of subjects, or if this is your major, then you're X amount less likely to find meaningful employment when you're done. Or, there has to be that vocational type of conversation. More of that has to be had with the students so they can make the proper choices in the first place to ensure that they get into work that produces enough money for them to repay what the obligations that they've taken on, right? Okay. So there's a number of pathways to get there. But again, if the issue, I would be straight up with you that there's no plans on our part to make education free at the university level.
I think first off, Al, thanks 100% for the honesty. It's obviously always the top policy, and I think that I do understand where you're coming from, and I'm not necessarily an advocate for free education either. I understand exactly what you're saying. There's some folks that need that extra hand to be able to make it into university. Those financial barriers that stand in place are way heavier costs for some others. I think that it's always going to be an issue that we're going to continue to need to work on for students. But at the same time, I totally understand and see your point of view on there's some other issues that are pressing and resources may be limited. So I'll just toss it down to the next question. You also touched on a lot of the stuff that I was hoping to hit on there, not hoping to hit on, but was going to ask you in terms of graduates ending up with some debt, but I think that you touched on that nicely. I'll just toss it down to the next question, which is that we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately impacted some groups over others, no matter where you're at in society. But also further exacerbated certain inequalities that were pre-existing within our society. So we're just wondering, what kinds of policies, if any, will you and your party pursue to reinforce racial and social justice in our communities?
This is it's when I grew up in the '60s, it was and '70s, it was more immediate and in your face, and we wanted to do something about it, and my generation wanted to do something about it. obviously when you come back, not enough was done. Of course, we have to work on that. What we can do specifically, it's a difficult question to say. You talked about it disproportionately affecting one group over another. Well, that goes back to factors of education that we already talked about. Who can get access to education? There's all kinds of sociological factors. When I studied in university, I studied community psychology, and at the time there was a study in Halifax on how to deal with people in youth and redirecting them away from punishment for small crimes and stuff like that.
Like restorative justice.
Yeah, restorative justice. So as an honor student, what I made up a questionnaire for students of how they would enter the criminal justice thing, if they ever entered it, how they entered it. And I went to one community, one school, and it was a predominantly African American that were there. And I was startled that the school was so predominantly that way. But when I designed this questionnaire, the answer to the question was essentially, you had one end of the city of Halifax where people were more wealthy, and the other end where people were poor. And it was remarkable, the difference in the answers to the question. What was happening was the people who were in the wealthy areas, they were being directed away from the criminal justice system, like a stern talking to or something like that, where the people from the poorer areas were directed into the criminal justice system. So we have, it was not so much a psychological issue, it was a sociological issue of those inequalities that were there then and are persistent. And absolutely they need to be corrected. And I've known this for a long time. And but back when we were late 60s, when we were it's just, when we're on the subject, the Conservative candidate had gotten in a little trouble for some comments he was making on his Facebook page, and a friend shared my page, and a gentleman got on there and asked, "Is he racist?" And I relayed an old story of years ago, almost 50 years ago. I was hitchhiking across the Texas Panhandle, and a black man picked me up, and he asked me if I wanted a drink. And I said yes, of course. And he handed me his own drink, which I took a drink of. And then when I was done with that, he gave me my own drink. And I wondered at the time, what was done to you to make you think it was necessary to get me to touch my lips where yours had touched, as if you were as less significant than I was. So I'm from a generation that fought to break down those barriers, not to build those barriers. And again, as I said, it's a complicated subject, looking at the ways that you can correct it. I know there's a lot of community initiatives now to have conversations about it, which are helpful. But a lot of this inequality is due to educational things, and a lot of it is like I said to you, is that it's that access to education for those people who can least afford it, right? And then there's the question of getting them to the point where they want to pursue further education, and again back to the vocations that lead them into jobs that are secure jobs, that are well-paying jobs, that are in something that's the right fit for them. So it's a complicated thing, but there are pathways to it, right? If we make the proper steps, and you look at the issue on all those multiple levels and see what it is, where are the barriers specifically at, to find where those barriers are at and how to overcome them, and what bottlenecks are there, and things like that. The people who generally work in those areas would be more knowledgeable on those subjects. I don't pretend to be an expert on every aspect of it, but certainly you need, if you intend to be an MP, you have to get yourself educated on it. I may be more knowledgeable on another subject than this subject, but I think an MP has to have their heart in the right direction in order to do that, right? They have to recognize that, yes, there are issues there, and they're serious issues, and we got to look at ways of resolving them.
Yeah, for sure. Firstly, yeah, just really great to hear from you, Al, in terms of, one, being able to, just straight up acknowledging the fact that, yes, this is a deep systemic issue, but also one that you're willing and ready to fight against. And not being the one that's building barriers, but actually being the generation that's going to continuously take them down, I think is very important. So yeah, thank you for your response. That's fantastic. The last kind of student-specific question that we had is that another issue that's been at the forefront of conversation on campus and around the world the last few years is the issue of climate change. So youth will be disproportionately impacted by the drastic changes in our environment, and this will probably exponentially increase as time goes on. It's one thing that's really at the forefront of a lot of students' minds nowadays. So we're really just wondering what ideas you and your party would look at in terms of just tackling this climate emergency head on.
First of all, in the conversation about it, and I'll talk about the climate change itself and our policy related to climate change, but the economic aspect of it again enters into it. Now, what is it going to cost us to switch over, and more importantly, how are we going to switch over? The last election, Sean Fraser, Liberals, said they were going to plant 2 billion trees. I've planted more trees in my garden this year than the Liberals have planted. And you see this from all the parties. There's no specifics on what they're going to do. It's always, they speak to you in generalities. And I'm always leery of round numbers. If you hear we're going to create 500, the rounder it is, the more leery of it. If you're going to make 200,000 jobs, that's, it's pretty round. But if you're going to make 500,000, that's even rounder. Same as 2 billion trees, right? These round numbers, I'm always leery of them, because what they lack is the detail of how you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Right. So our policy as a party is that the provinces should do the work around climate change. And the first way to start it off here, I think if we look at it, we'll say there's climate change deniers, and we'll call them that. Right. But the reality is that oil is a finite resource, and no matter how you look at it, we are going to have to transition away from the oil in the first place. Yeah. So as a society and as every single individual in it, we have to find ways to make that transition and find out what that transition is going to be. I'm on the board of directors of a windmill company. Okay. I've been recycling before recycling was a thing. It's always, I'm a naturalist and have been for years, so I recognize the effects that we have on climate. But again, in order to cut that conversation off of whether somebody's denying climate change or somebody is not, we have to look at it in terms of this finite resource oil and say, okay, how are we going to circumvent this? What are we actually going to do? So all the other parties, their primary position is a carbon tax. Yeah. And I've argued that this carbon tax is in a lot of cases, a lot of bureaucratic churning, taking money for something, distributing parts of it out to somebody because they did this or they did that. And how the mechanism is supposed to work is that your price of gas goes up so much that I stop driving my truck and I go to an electric vehicle or a compact vehicle, which I have with my own business. I have a couple of smart cars and have had that for ever since the model came out, and I've been carrying on with it for over a decade now. probably closer to 2 decades, whenever it was that they originally came out. So again, as I said, as being on the board of directors of a windmill company, I know how much energy we can produce with wind, and I know what the province does. Like when Nova Scotia is a perfect example of how we should handle this. Many people don't know it, but when I provide that wind power, it's at a subsidized rate. You pay more for your electricity than you would if it was produced with oil. So instead of the carbon tax, you're paying the higher cost for power through that mechanism. Now, the other element is we have negotiated contracts with Newfoundland and Muskrat Falls. So when that Nova Scotia Power paid $1 billion, i.e. the people who pay Nova Scotia Power through their bills, paid $1 billion to build the underseas cable that brings power from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. And it's my argument that what we need to do, and Newfoundland got in trouble with that, but we're meeting, the province sets green objectives periodically. They set in legislation what our objectives are going to be on green power. And they try to meet those targets, and then they set new goals in the future when those targets are met. And that's coming up for review soon. So what happened with, I believe it's 15% of Muskrat Falls that we're supposed to get, or their capacity from our building this undersea cable. And Newfoundland has use for parts of it also. But the plan then was to send it to the Eastern Seaboard and sell it to bring back money in the economy. But since then, the Americans, particularly around Pennsylvania and so on, they've started doing fracking, so they're bringing up oil, and they're essentially eliminating the demand for this Muskrat Falls power. Now, what I've been arguing is that we take the Muskrat Falls power, the excess, and Nova Scotia takes a larger portion of that. And with our windmills and with our power, Newfoundland is going to be taxed more heavily on their oil resources. So what I'm saying is we build that symbiotic relationship with Newfoundland where we transfer some of their what they take in carbon tax and everything for producing all this oil, and we take Muskrat Falls so they can have that trade-off there. And this is a long-term thing. These things can't be done overnight, and they can't be done by the magic we're going to plant 2 billion trees wand. It just don't work. You have to have realistic ways that you're going to arrive at this thing, and this province has realistic ways of arriving at it. And as a federal government, it's important that we support that, and it's important that we discuss ways that we can further that to make sure that this happens. And that, because the party's policy is that you let the provinces do that, the provinces can sometimes come up with better ideas than what Ottawa does and not get this, like I said, economic churning. Because if you go out and gas has been going up in price for decades, and there was a period where people started to move towards more compact vehicles, and then we got into the SUV age. So obviously this carbon tax as a mechanism to push people over to these other areas is not working. So what we're saying is that while the Nova Scotia one works, their model, this carbon tax model is not working, and for that reason we don't believe that the carbon tax is a proper way to reach these targets. So it's testing the possibilities and allowing that freedom of movement. And admittedly, the carbon tax doesn't apply to us. In all fairness, the carbon tax doesn't apply to us because we have made these adjustments, because this province has gone that way. But again, how I'm extending it is saying that oil will be required for a lot more things than producing energy. And switching over to alternate energy is not as easy as we wish. I won't say think, I'll say as we wish. Right now, through wind energy, on a good day, on a good windy day, we can supply 40% of current demand in the province. But the wind doesn't blow in the summer as much as it blows in the winter.
Right.
And if you went to solar, the sun doesn't shine as much in the winter as it does in the summer. So we can't, it's hard to get those two components working together, right? Yeah, you're looking at almost, it's not quite that far, but you're almost looking at a singular source one part of the year and the other singular source the other part of the year. So right now that we can produce that 40%, but if we convert every building in the province from oil to electricity, and if we convert every single one of the 4 to 5 million or more vehicles we have in the province to electricity, you can imagine the extra demand that there will be for power, right, to produce that electricity, or demand for that specifically for that electricity. And then we'll have to reconstruct the grid. And right now the grid it's estimated that in the US it'll cost them $5 trillion to get the grid to this capacity where it can carry all this power. In Canada, because we're a smaller population but larger area, I would expect it would be at least $1 trillion here, and we're talking huge numbers here. And you know, with all the other pressing issues and the crisis in healthcare and the crisis in affordability, it's the wise allocation of funds has to occur, and prioritization of how we're going to spend funds, and it's colossal and almost overwhelming for people. And it's particularly disturbing when children have to get involved in complex issues like this, to, you know, for legislators to sit up and say we have to do something other than just making these pie in the skies promises about trees or this, and look at the real specifics. If they don't have any specifics for you, they don't have any idea what they're going to do. They're just moving along and hoping that something will come up somewhere. Technology will develop in a certain way, or, you know, something will get us out of here, with no clear plan on how to do it. And that's generally the pattern on climate. And again, I don't like to phrase it like it's commonly done in the sense of climate change, because it alienates the people who don't believe in it, and it alienates it just, they don't want to commit to it, and we need everybody committed to it. So from my perspective, oil will run out even if we continue to use it at the rate we're using it, or at an increased rate. It is going to run out. So sooner or later we are going to have to deal with this problem. And the longer out we have before that oil supply is gone, and there'll be strategic reserves that are held back in the end, right, that to produce the other things that we need it produced. So we have to look at this long-term plan of how we're actually going to do this transition, not just come up with this, we're going to spend this many dollars and this many jobs are going to be created from this, and we're going to go green. It's like your magic fairy wand, you're going to wave and fix this. It's not going to happen that way. It's a tough slog, and careful consideration to everything we do has to be made, and it takes time. And when you have that cumbersome bureaucracy to wade through to get there, and the resistance to change here and the resistance to change over there, it's a colossal task to work your way through it, and you have to have a real workhorse like me to yeah.
No, I see what you're saying. It is a large issue that expands, like, even past, like, obviously it expands, like, to the whole world, and I agree with you. It really takes that unifying force, everybody to get on board, but also real dissection of the ideas. And it's great to hear, like, some different ideas, some different ways of going about it that could have a bigger impact, right, with Muskrat Falls, and just like taking a different look at the way that we do things. But I do love to hear that this is an issue that you take seriously and that you've been committed to for decades. That's really good to hear. I've just got 2 more questions for you. Last one is pretty short, but firstly, what would your message be to students or just youth in general that are showing up to the polls this election?
My suggestion to them is to try to cut through some of the rhetoric that goes on. Politicians typically go out and what they do is they want everybody's vote. So I'm trying to be polite here. I don't want to say they talk out of both sides of their mouth, but they will promise people things that they, in the end, can't deliver. And I have no intention of promising somebody something that I can't deliver and something that we can't afford. And I would say look past at some of the things that you're hearing and analyze them. Think about them and think if this person is genuine, if these are real solutions that they're talking about. And again, I'll go back to the trees. It's just something nice that, everybody loves a tree, especially me, as being a naturalist. Yeah. I love trees. But, where are you going to put them? Are you going to cover the farmland that you need? Or where? Where are they going to go? Are we going to put them up north? Where are we going to put them? Are we going to tree all the cities so that there's no space for parkways or parks and stuff like that? Or where are you going to put them? And it's again, and I hate to pick on just the Liberals specifically because it's the same pattern with the other parties. It's these pie in the sky notions with no real definitive direction on where we're going to go. And that's what people have to look at. Not only students, but people in general. Every person of voting age has to consider this. And it's time to leave the voting for what your grandmother voted for behind us and look at the parties. The Green Party leader, when she was on stage, was absolutely right about that everybody has to be included in this discussion when she was on the debate stage. She's absolutely correct. And in the first round of the election, we were excluded for the most part from the conversation because of false charges of racism. And that is the kind of thing we have to look past and determine. I was disturbed in the last election. I did we did a debate here, and a young lady got up and she asked me about somebody who was a racist who was involved in the foundation of the party when it first came up. And I took I knew this was coming, and I took the personal, how do I defend myself? And, and I talked about my father fought in Sicily and North Africa, and my wife's uncle fought in Denmark. And, so I've had, and they're not the only ones in my family that did, so, and my interest was always been in history. So I've studied the Second World War from one end to the other and have hundreds of books on it in my library. And 7 or 8 volume set on the atrocities that were committed on the Jews over there. And so I did the personal thing that, no, this is not me. I have nothing to do with racism, when I should have defended the party and said, this person was kicked out of the party because of those beliefs when it was found out. Because you're a new young party and people are coming at you from every direction. You don't have the personnel to analyze every person who supports you to say, do they realize sincerely what our policies are and our perspective on these issues, or are they just people that came in? And I failed to answer her question. She was kind of shuffled away when I gave my personal answer to the question rather than defending the party this way. And I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't do it. I failed to properly communicate to people in an honest, sincere way. And that's, again, I'm talking about this because this is what students need to do. They need to to look at my mistakes and question, and she was right to stand there and ask for a more direct answer from me, and it was a failure on my part to not do it. And so I'm confessing my attrition to her right now here as my last comment on that.
So your overarching message is really just try and really take a look at like the party platforms, but also cut through the things that you may not find are particularly true, but at the same time also leave room for leave room for new ideas to blossom, leave room to check out new parties, and don't, like, along that line.
Don't judge people based on what other people tell you about them. Find out yourself. Find out if what you said is true, because sometimes people have motives for saying what they say. I mean, we're in an election and people want to get elected, and they say things that aren't true in order to do it. And so it's a difficult job, but they have to try to cut through this and find out what's real. Yes, they have to filter the message and find out what's real and not real in it. And it's a difficult thing. They have a lot of responsibilities. They have their own schoolwork they're working on, and their future to look forward to, and there's a lot of distractions. It's just simply making ends meet. Yeah. And so you don't necessarily have the time and energy to put into studying the issues. But the way to approach it is with an open mind, and if you hear these charges that are often baseless against somebody, you should look at them carefully to make sure that you know what they are before you repeat that false message to somebody else, because it filters down through. When you want to get, if you're going to pass on information to people, you want that to be accurate information that you're passing on. It's just not regurgitating what somebody else said without investigating it yourself. It's important to do that, and despite the short period of time they have to do it and their other obligations, it's what they need to be done to make a wise choice when they get to the ballot box.
Fantastic, thanks, Al. So yeah, I like that message. And lastly, we just have a fun final question for you, and it's, what is your go-to karaoke song?
I would have to say it's Bon Jovi. Bon Jovi was one of the later ones, but if it's
specific songs from Bon Jovi?
I don't know the name of it, but I think it's Dead or Alive.
Oh yeah.
And if it's they say they're the same as Zeppelin, but I love Greta Van Fleet.
That's awesome. I love to hear it. Okay, thanks again, Al, for coming in today. So once again, StFX, this is Al Muir. He's the candidate for the PPC this time around, and you can check out this interview on our YouTube, but also on our Instagram. So yeah, thanks again, and that concludes this.